All right, so Joe Manchin, the corrupted ghoul from West Virginia, is back at it again, this time showing us a little bit of his mob boss side as a journalist. Finally worked up the courage, as we have completely seen an absence of actual journalism surrounding Joe Manchin in recent months, but a journalist finally worked up the courage to ask him the very obvious question of, hey, listen, you've been coming out and opposing portions of this $3.5 trillion bill, specifically some of the climate portions of the bill, and you also just so happen to be making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year from a coal company that you helped to found and that your son actually now owns. So is there a correlation there? Could this be why you are against some of the climate legislation? So we finally got a reporter to actually ask this substantive question from Joe Manchin. And how does he respond? He responds by turning in to an absolute mob boss. So here we have from Ari Natter. Manchin asked by Ari Natter on whether an energy company that he founded is a conflict of interest as he negotiates reconciliation. Manchin, quote, "I've been in a blind trust for 20 years. I have no idea what they're doing." It's a complete fucking lie, okay? Ari says, "You're still getting dividends from this company." And Manchin says, "You got a problem?" He literally said, "You got a problem, motherfucker? Listen, what are you, some kind of journalist? What are you gonna ask me substantive questions about my conflicts of interest? You got a fucking problem here, my guy." And then he continues, and it gets even more mob boss-like. More from Ari Natter. "The energy company Manchin founded, your son still owns it, doesn't he?" And Manchin says, "You do best to change the subject here, buddy. You do best to change the subject." That's what Joe Manchin responds to an actual substantive question, which is like the only time we've heard reporters actually challenge Joe Manchin on this very blatant and obvious and open corruption. And just a reminder on exactly what he's talking about here. So here from Vice News, Joe Manchin makes $500,000 a year from one of the dirtiest coal plants in West Virginia. That's more than twice his salary as a U.S. senator. So I wonder where Joe Manchin's priorities might happen to fall. Okay, obviously not on the climate change aspects of this legislation. Obviously, he is going to be defending the fossil fuel industry that he is profiting more than from his actual position in Congress. So, listen, and he's also on the Energy Committee to add, another slap in the face on top of this. This is the guy who's going to be writing substantial portions of the climate portions of these bills because of his position on the Energy Committee. So this is the open and brazen and ridiculous corruption that exists and is baked in to the United States Congress, okay? This is the type of question that Joe Manchin should have been getting the entire time that we've been having these negotiations, okay? There was never a point in which he was a good faith actor. And him and Sinema are really the same in this exact same way, because for Manchin, it's, his coal company being a compromising and conflict of interest on climate legislation and other portions of it as well. Sinema, we know that she just took $750,000 from the big pharmaceutical industry, and what do you know? She turns around and opposes lowering prescription drug prices. Wow, I wonder if there's a correlation there. It's really just, it's hard to wrap your mind around this, really, apparently at least for some of these reporters. But we finally get somebody to ask this goddamn easy question from Joe Manchin, and he folds immediately. Immediately he folds and has absolutely no legitimate explanation for how this isn't a conflict of interest. So more than anything, honestly, this just shows us how much our media has been a complete failure throughout this entire process. They have been taking Manchin and Sinema seriously as if they are like some, moderately tempered centrists who are all-knowing and are just representing their conservative voters in their state. It's complete bullshit. He's not representing conservative voters. He's representing ExxonMobil. He's representing his own fucking interests in this coal company that he is invested in. Of course, he doesn't want to invest in climate change legislation that would require getting rid of industries like the coal company that he is profiting to the tunes of millions of dollars from, okay? So this is the situation that we have right now. Joe Manchin turning into an absolute mob boss when pressed even to the slightest degree. We also have a little bit more information coming out of where Joe Manchin is standing right now in terms of this $3.5 trillion bill. So a new Manchin statement here from Manu Raju of CNN. While I am hopeful that a common ground can be found that would result in another historic investment in our nation, I cannot and won't support trillions in spending or an all-or-nothing approach that ignores the brutal fiscal reality our nation faces. The brutal fiscal... What the fuck are you even talking about, my guy? He's literally just making this up. We don't have a brutal fiscal reality that our nation is facing. The brutal reality that our nation is facing is that parents can't afford childcare. It's that we aren't addressing the existential threat of climate change. It's that people can't afford, and they are dying because they can't afford their prescription drugs, okay? These are the actual brutal realities of the United States of America. And Joe Manchin wants you to worry more about the national debt, the goddamn national debt, which is an entirely arbitrary and made up bullshit issue that politicians use all the time to just justify austerity. Okay, here's how you know if a politician is bullshitting you on the national debt and the deficit, okay? If they actually care about letting or lowering the national debt or lowering the deficit, the two things that they would bring up, which are the most substantial portions of what is adding to the debt and the deficit, is one, they would suggest we raise taxes on the wealthy, which, what do you know, Joe Manchin is entirely opposed to doing that, and that's a big portion of the $3.5 trillion bill that he is opposing. Okay, so you would raise taxes on the wealthy, and two, you would cut the goddamn military budget, which is 52% of our discretionary budget, while the Pentagon can't even pass a fucking audit to tell us where that money is going. Largely, it's going to defense contractors who are shoving it in their pockets and profiting off of bombing innocent civilians overseas. So those are the two areas that if you were serious about the national debt and the deficit, which they're not really big problems, but if you actually thought that there were problems, you would be raising taxes on the wealthy and cutting the military budget, two things that Joe Manchin would never entertain in a million years. So he's entirely bullshitting everybody when he talks about the brutal fiscal reality of our nation. He's a fucking liar, okay? He's a psychopath. But continuing, we have a little bit more details as he has officially set his top line, and this is even more grotesque, okay? Joe Manchin, coming from one of the poorest states in the entire country, in West Virginia, which some of these groups within the UN have traveled to West Virginia and other states around the United States. And I'll link this down in the description below if you want to fact check me. But we have literally had UN representatives come to the United States in parts of West Virginia and all across the United States, where they have described conditions that are no different than the third world, okay? No different than not the wealthiest nation in the world, but some of the poorest nations in the world, okay? This is Joe Manchin's state. It's one of the poorest and most underfunded and gutted and under-resourced states in the entire country. And this is what he says: my top line has been 1.5 trillion because I believe in my heart that what we can do and what needs we have right now and what we can afford to do without basically changing our whole society to an entitlement mentality. An entitlement mentality. Okay, that's what Joe Manchin calls lowering prescription drug prices so that they are affordable for average Americans and they don't have to die because they can't afford their drugs. That's what Joe Manchin calls entitlement mentality, or being able to afford childcare or any of the other number of things, free community college so people can actually go and get a good education without being bankrupted, right? This is what Joe Manchin is talking about as an entitlement mentality. Meanwhile, we know the actual motivations for what he is doing here, okay? It is to sabotage this $3.5 trillion bill because it is actually good for the American people. It is an investment in the American people, and Joe Manchin, who only wants investments into his corporate buddies and the industries that he himself profits from, obviously has a problem with that. So that's the situation that we have right now. Joe Manchin coming out and acting like a complete mob boss while trying to make demands as if anybody should be taking him seriously, and absolutely nobody should be taking him seriously. So follow in Bernie Sanders' lead. Don't vote for this bipartisan bill unless the $3.5 trillion bill is passed in its entirety and at the same exact time. That's the line that progressives have to hold, and if they don't hold that line, they're really just caving in to one of the most corrupt and evil ghouls in the entire country.